Greetings, comrades, and welcome back to another episode of the Comrade Cast. And today, we are here to talk about what everybody's talking about. But as you can see, I've rearranged the setup a little bit so I can actually look up into the camera. The camera's like up and away from me, rather than me looking to the side and having to pivot all the time. Still not happy with the lighting in this new setup, but I'm sure we'll get there. As usual, unfortunately, it's been a real difficult time to fit this podcast into my daily schedule. As I mentioned, I am in full business grind mode. There's a lot of work going on. And who would have known that starting a business would be so much work and take so many hours? But that being said, it is way more satisfying than what I did previously. And part of what I hope will make this episode somewhat special and somewhat differentiate me from what a lot of people have brought to the table in regards to this case is that I used to, of course, be former law enforcement before I quit and started my own business. And today I am finally going to reveal some of what I used to do and talk about a few stories and how I feel that based on my experience and what I've known and the types of cases I've had to investigate, why a lot of what we're hearing is total bullshit. So that should be fun. That should be interesting. And I get to share some of maybe a few crazy stories that I had from my previous life. So, of course, we are going to be talking about the Epstein-Trump cover-up. I've never actually talked about Epstein on this podcast before. This will be the first time that I'm actually getting the opportunity to talk about this. And I'm going to be able to bring some of my own insights to the table here, and hopefully that'll bring a lot of value to you guys. But what I do want to start off here is lay my cards out on the table where I stand, what I believe. Of course, I believe that Trump and Epstein were good friends, that Epstein, of course, trafficked women for Trump, and that they were definitely involved in some extremely nefarious activities, to put it mildly. The one thing I've never really bought into is this idea of that the child sex abusers rule the world. What I do more so believe, and what is 100% an obvious fact in reality, is that people in positions of power, people with money, people with connections are able to get away with much more in terms of illicit activities than the average people. There is no question a two-tiered justice system, one for the average person and one for the rich and powerful. And those people in that rich and powerful cohort can get away with a lot of things, all the way up to murder if they have enough money, if they have enough connections, and all the way, of course, to child sex abuse in certain cases. And obviously, Epstein was one of the big ringleaders in a scenario where he was able to effectively traffic young women for the purposes of not just effectively prostituting these out to rich and powerful men, but I also am very confident that he used information that he gathered from either the girls that he trafficked to blackmail people, or of course them being involved in the acts in and of themselves to blackmail people and keep people effectively from revealing what was going on, and also be able to broker that information to other entities or even get payments from certain people to be like, just shut the hell up, man. Just don't talk about this. Here's $100 million to engage in some tax services so that you don't open your mouth. And another thing that I don't really think is real is that Epstein was a direct agent for an intelligence agency, whether that's the CIA, Mossad, or some other intelligence agency somewhere in the world. I think it's very probable that he was an asset in the sense that, let's say that one of these intelligence agencies came to him and said, I need some information on this person. Here's a stack of dollars. Will you provide it? And he would say, yes, here you go. So I think that is much more likely because in the way that these people work, in a way that particularly when you get up to these high levels of career criminals, they need to have some sort of plausible deniability. To have someone work directly for an agency, like for him to be exactly like, I am an employee of the CIA, I'm an employee of Mossad, this completely obliterates any kind of plausible deniability that can exist, which is bad for the relationship of both parties. because neither of these parties want to be seen as directly working with one another. If the proverbial shit hits the fan, they want to be able to say there was a barrier. This intelligence agency can say that this was a barrier. There was a barrier between myself and this individual. This individual wasn't on our payroll, but it's very possible that they approached them for information at some point. So there's a difference between effectively being an asset for somebody and being an active agent. And that's one of the things I think that's really gripped the conversation, has gripped the imaginations of a lot of people, is that there is so many different twists and turns and possible scenarios that it's very easy for through this kind of game of telephone almost, for things to escalate up and up and up and up to the point where he was directly working for the CIA. Not so sure about that, but it's definitely possible that he passed information on to them or to some other intelligence agency at some point in time. And in that vein, one of the things that we see people talk about when it comes to Epstein is the list, is they want to see the client list. And I don't think that there was an express client list in the sense that here are all the people that came to the island, when they came to the island, how long they stayed, who they saw, and here is the tape of them engaging in illicit activity. There's not that exact list laid out in excruciating detail, but there is certainly enough information that you would be able to collect once you put Epstein through court, once you arrest him, once you start collecting documents, that you as a law enforcement agency could effectively make that list on your own and then take that and use that as evidence to charge people who are on that list with sexual assault of a minor. And the reason you wouldn't have such an exhaustive list with so much detail excruciatingly spelled out is because once you get to this point where you are a career criminal and you are making your money and you're living professionally through illicit activities, he did this for a long time, obviously, before he finally got busted and taken out of commission. The reason why you wouldn't do that is because if you're smart about it, you don't want to make, it's not like you're writing a list. Here are all the bad things I've done, and here's exactly how I did it, and all the information is right there in black and white. If you're smart, you don't run like that. And I would say that Epstein was smart enough to be able to obfuscate that to the point where he's not going to incriminate himself so directly. People also confuse the list with maybe the contact book, for example. If you guys ever want the Epstein contact book in its unredacted glory, you can reach out to me on Discord. I will send it to you. I have it in my hard drive along with some other files on this case. You want to actually see who was on the client, who was on the contact list. AC, I almost got myself mixed up there. If you want to see who was on the contact list, I'll be happy to send that to you. But the point here being is that because it's actually not necessarily Epstein's, but Maxwell's, his number one associate's little black book, this is the list of contacts that they have. And there's enough plausible deniability in a legal sense where if you get a hold of this list and I give it to you or you find it on the internet, if you know where to look, this is just basically people's contact information. Now, I'm in this whole entrepreneurial thing. This is Ghislaine Maxwell's CRM. This is Epstein's CRM, right? This is just a list of contacts that they've made. This doesn't mean that these people have necessarily been to the island, engaged in the services that Epstein has to offer, and went from there. These are people that they have just marked down. I can phone these people. I can contact these people. Maybe we have lower level contact just because, right? And in my quote unquote CRM, I have lots of people that I have one conversation with, and then I put their contact information in there. It's not like we're in contact all the time. It's not that they were a client of mine. This is just someone that I've had just the briefest of engagements with. But you save that information in case, you want to move forward or you have something in the future that they might want to purchase from you. So the long story short here is that the contact list itself isn't the client list, right? This isn't the people who came to the island and engaged in the illicit activities and engaged in the sexual assault of minors. But with what you would have seized as law enforcement, you would be able to effectively draft that list in and of yourself, because there are flight logs and there are contact lists and there are videos, and you can use all of that information to put together a pretty clear picture yourself if you're actually doing an appropriate investigation. And if you're not going to do an appropriate investigation, as it would seem like the FBI is not going to do in this case, there's going to be a pretty darn good reason. Because again, particularly from a law enforcement perspective, you would have all of the information that you need to actually be able to put together a very comprehensive picture and then be able to use the evidence you've gathered to actually go out and charge people with real evidence who have gone to this island. And when it comes to the videos themselves, so let's move into the kind of touch point that started this whole firestorm. So this came out in early July here. This is the memo that started the whole firestorm, where basically the FBI came out and said, hey, we're going to close the Epstein file. He did it all himself. There's no client list. He wasn't working with any larger intelligence agencies or anything like that. We're 2 weeks into this whole firestorm. And it is dying down, I think, a little bit, which is part of the reason why I can come in and do a little bit more of a comprehensive analysis. I've been wanting to jump in here and talk about this for a little while. Not only do I have time constraints, but there's also things are changing so rapidly that I'm waiting to have at least somewhat of a lull, because one of the things that I like to do with this podcast is come in when the information has settled a little bit. One thing I dislike with a lot of political YouTubers and commentators about this is that they're just going off with whatever happens in the moment, and one video, one commentary, one discussion about this thing is going to be completely irrelevant the next day, because they're not talking about this on a holistic basis. Things are changing so rapidly, things are changing so violently, that what I say from day to day or what they say from day to day is effectively irrelevant. And I don't want that. I want to have at least some sort of lull where I can digest what has happened and actually give some sort of reasonable, comprehensive, and valuable analysis here. And so this is the whole firestorm that kicked everything off. And the reason why this is such a big issue, it's severalfold. And one thing I like to do, as I've mentioned several times on this podcast, is I keep a roster of right-wing people that I watch to try and keep in contact with what the right is saying. And for years, the Epstein files have been a huge point of contention. You'll see people like Laura Loomer very famously on the right said that now that Trump has won, the Democrats are quaking because he's going to release the Epstein files. Now it's the Democrats who are demanding that the Epstein files be released. And this contradiction in terms is very difficult for anybody to stomach. And the whole case around Epstein has been really emblematic of one of the, and quite frankly, I do think that this is an important political battle of our time that the right has grabbed onto and the left is left in the dust. And one of the reasons why one of my biggest political projects in my lifetime is to effectively try and create some sort of left-wing movement that isn't tied to the ever-crumbling status quo and isn't authoritarian nationalism, right-wing nonsense that we get on a regular basis from the right these days. I want to create something that exists outside of the status quo, outside of what exists right now, but is a left-wing movement, an anti-establishment left-wing movement, because, as I mentioned, the establishment is crumbling, neoliberalism is crumbling, and for the left in general to grab onto this crumbling infrastructure is a terrible move politically. And I think finally people are waking up to that, at least on the left. I see a lot more people on the left becoming radicalized because of what Trump is doing, because of how disastrous this White House has been. And now it's even like people on the right are realizing that Trump is the status quo now. He is the crumbling status quo. And this Epstein files has really shown that. And as I was about to say, is that one of the major political battles of the time that the right has grabbed onto is the elites, quote unquote, the mysterious elites versus the regular people. The part about this whole fight is that things are 100% getting worse for the regular people. Life is getting more and more difficult, but it's not the trans people, it's not the immigrants, it's the fact that all of the money, all of the power, all of the things that give you access to a good life have been stripped away from you and been siphoned off onto the upper levels of society. Throughout my entire life, I've seen the money, I've seen the power go only in one direction, and it's upwards. So for Trump to come in and effectively betray this fundamental core pillar of right-wing ideology for the last 10 years or so is hugely devastating. It's hugely damaging for him to come out and say, nothing to see here, even though they have been riding this for, like I said, a decade. It's completely destroying the right wing on an ideological level, on a core fundamental level. And there's a couple things that I liken this to. Like, one of the big things that destroyed the communist movement in the United States, communism used to be a lot more powerful, a lot more popular in the United States up until the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Because what happened there was that Nazi Germany was demonized, and rightly so, that these are the big enemies that we have to be facing. These are the guys that are going to hold us back. These are the guys that are going to destroy the world. These are our number one ideological opponents. Then all of a sudden, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact comes out, and everything switches on its head. And we're actually working with the Germans now. We have this trade agreement. We have this non-aggression pact. And actually, it's the capitalists who are the number one, the liberal capitalists who are the number one enemy, not the fascist Germans anymore. And people who were in the Communist Party at the time are like, what the hell, man? You have been feeding us this line that we have been fighting this ideological opponent for years, and all of a sudden you're switching it on its head. That's a bunch of bullshit. That's a bunch of nonsense. And what happened was you had this huge schism in which the party never recovered from in the United States, where if you still remained a member of the Communist Party after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, it's clear that you weren't ideologically aligned with the goals of the political movement. What instead you were was a stooge for Moscow, that you would do whatever Moscow said, you would do whatever Stalin said, and you weren't actually in the fight for the international revolution. You were just a puppet. And I feel like, in a similar sense, this is what is happening here now with the MAGA movement, that we've had the evil child-abusing elites that have been getting away with everything are our number one opponents. They're what's holding us back. They're what's holding us down. They're destroying Western civilization. They're getting away with everything. And now, all of a sudden, your guy's in power. He says, nothing to see here. Nothing we can do about it. We'll just wash our hands out of this. And it's a bridge too far for a lot of people. And it's something that in debates now, I think that we as leftists should never, ever let go. It's like, you say that you are the arbiters of truth and justice and you have the moral high ground, but here you are defending a child sex trafficking ring. Here you are defending the elites that have ripped you off, that have been laughing in your face, that have been spitting in your eye for so long. How do you square that circle? How do you reconcile that? And that is the people who still are on board with this, because there's definitely been a divide in my kind of right-wing roster that I have seen, is that the people who are more tied to the establishment, more tied to the Trump regime, are trying to bury this. They're trying to forget about it. They're trying to move on from it. But the people who are more in the kind of hardcore populist sphere, that they don't really care about Trump necessarily, it's more about the idea, it's more about the ideology. They are vehemently opposed to what's happening. They are extremely angry. And whenever I go into comments now, even on right-wing channels, the vibe has completely shifted, that people are no longer riding Trump. They're ripping him constantly. They're calling him a traitor. They're saying that he's protecting child sex traffickers. Obviously, I don't think these people are going to become revolutionary communists or anything like that. But there's a huge divide here, particularly among the base, and they are struggling to reconcile this. And even there's a divide among the kind of commentary class. They're trying to move on from this in some cases, but you can see that the people who are more about the actual ideology are in on Epstein 100%. Another example I used, and this is a hypothetical one, this would be like if Mamdani, and obviously I'm a Mamdani fan, one thing that I think he's done so well is something that I have been harping on about, is that the most successful left-wing figures in my life have kind of amplified this happy warrior archetype. Yes, they're going to fight. Yes, they're going to go to bat before our beliefs. Yes, they're going to protect working class people. Yes, they're going to protect the marginalized, but they're going to look like they're having the time of their lives while doing it. And that's one of the things that I think has been really the secret sauce to Mamdani's success, is that, yeah, he's going out there and he's fighting, but he's always smiling. He's always looks like he's having a great time. And that kind of energy just draws people so naturally. And I think on the left, we've lost that happiness, right? That, yes, no one's going to say that we're not out there fighting. But in a lot of cases, many people look like they're miserable while they're doing it. And I think that Mamdani doesn't, and he's really tapped into that happy warrior archetype that has shown time and time again to be extremely successful in left-wing politics. But as I was saying, it would be like if Mamdani gets elected and then all of a sudden he's like, you know what? Trump's not a bad guy. Bring in the ICE agents. We're going to help them all out. No problem whatsoever. We're going to facilitate them in every way we can. That's effectively what's happening here with the Epstein files. It's a betrayal on a fundamental ideological level. And now we are really seeing who are the people who believe in this ideology and who are the people who are just Trump cultists. Okay, with that out of the way, let's move to the kind of next thing that I wanted to talk about here was this footage that we got. And this is one of the areas that I can really give you guys some enlightened commentary, if you will. Because as I mentioned before, I'm former law enforcement, and that involved several different roles that involved policing, but I got my feet wet working in a jail. And I worked in a jail for a while, and I got to learn about the ins and outs of prison culture. And at the time when Epstein was killed, I was working in a jail, but I was not a CO. I was what's called a caseworker, which is kind of like a parole officer who would work in a jail, and I would work with inmates on a bunch of different stuff, but that's in the weeds for now. But I remember when the whole Epstein dying in jail thing came out, we all thought that was so ridiculous that he would have killed himself in jail, knowing how jail culture works and how the whole operations and day-to-day grind goes. Yeah, we were talking like, there's no way that this guy killed himself. And one of the craziest things is that the guy was on suicide watch before he was moved back into, they called the special housing unit, the SHU. And that's the area where, the jail I worked at had a SHU. The special housing unit, this is for like maximum segregation inmates, people that need to be segregated from general population, mainly because of their crimes are so heinous that other inmates are going to kill them if they get the opportunity, that they are so high profile, that they have a lot of attention on their case. That's just Epstein's case. And some people, sometimes like high-level gang leaders, also go to the special housing unit to isolate them from their day-to-day operations, though they still find ways to run the gang, so it doesn't really do much. But regardless, so where he was held is a area meant for very high-profile individuals and segregated out from the rest of the general population, so he wouldn't have any contact with other people. For example, in the jail I worked at, the special housing unit, the inmates in there could only come out one at a time. Like, they couldn't even fraternize with other inmates on a regular basis. Like, they couldn't even come out and talk to each other, really. They would have to come out, exercise by themselves, do their phone calls by themselves, whatever. They wouldn't even have real human contact. And so, yeah, I'm not sure the system in the Metropolitan Correctional Center, I'm going to assume that it was like my jail at the time, where if guys are coming out of their cells, it's like one at a time. And generally speaking, you are going to have one inmate per cell in this special housing unit. You're not going to have multiple inmates in a cell together just because. And if you are, that was one of my job as when I was a caseworker, would be if we're going to put two people in a cell in a area like this, we're going to vet both inmates, make sure that they're compatible and they're not going to stab each other in the middle of the night type of thing. Yeah, before he was moved to the SHU, he was on suicide watch. And again, in my jail, being on suicide watch, didn't want to kill yourself before being on suicide watch, it would definitely make you want to kill yourself, because you were only let out of your cell like half an hour per day. You had a camera on you all of the time. You would be in like this thing, we called it a baby doll, which was like this type of safety security clothing that they'd even take away your underwear so you wouldn't hang yourself with your underwear or whatever. They put this like type of security clothing on you that made you look like you were like inside of a mattress or something. You looked ridiculous. But the whole purpose was to make it virtually impossible to kill yourself. One story I had was there was a guy who he tried to kill himself by trying to shoot himself in the face with a shotgun. Didn't work, and he had to have reconstructive surgery. They brought him to the jail, and he was immediately put on suicide watch. And within an hour, he's trying to kill himself by shoving soap and toilet paper down his throat. Wasn't successful, caught it before it happened. This wasn't where I was working at the time. This is just one of the stories that my coworkers had told me, and it was one of those incidents that happens that everybody hears about. But anyway, so long story short, someone wants to kill themselves, even on suicide watch, they're probably going to find a way. But for someone to be cleared off suicide watch and then sent back to the special housing unit, heads are going to roll in that circumstance if they actually end up killing themselves. Because why did you take this person off suicide watch who cleared them to be taken off suicide watch and then they actually commit suicide? That's definitely, no question about it, a fireable offense. And the guys who found Epstein were also fired regardless. But the thing that makes this hard for me to believe that the guy actually committed suicide by hanging is that's actually one of the harder ways to commit suicide in a jail. And the reason is because by and large, the cells are not designed in a way that you could easily hang yourself from any part of it. The one thing, though, I saw in his cell is that there is a ladder which could probably be used. In our jail, there wasn't a ladder. There was nothing you could tie a knot to. There was nothing you could get any kind of leverage on. There were certain types of tricks that if you knew what you were doing, you could commit the act. But the point is that was one of the hardest ways that if you're going to kill yourself, that's like the hardest way to do it. The easiest way is probably some sort of drug overdose. You take a bunch of drugs and then you overdose and then you die. And it's like the easiest way if you want to commit suicide to do it. But man, we're just getting dark, but this is a fucking dark episode. We were all thinking like, there's no way this guy actually hung himself in his cell, given what was in his cell and given what he had available to do it, plus him just coming off suicide watch. All of these things are huge red flags. And then, of course, we get the actual footage that they released a couple days ago, and there are numerous inconsistencies. One thing that does unfortunately happen is guys will sometimes say that they did rounds, say that they checked up on inmates and not actually do it. But that is 100% a fireable offense, because the minute you actually say that you did a round, they can check the cameras and see that you didn't do it, and you're going to get fired because of that. Your head is going to roll because of that. So it's an incredibly stupid thing to do, very stupid, but it happens, unfortunately. But the whole idea, the one thing that, like, when they brought this out is that initially it seemed like there's only 1 minute missing, but apparently people have now upped that to 3 minutes missing in this footage. First off, they were able to check the metadata and see basically that this was put through Adobe Premiere and put into at least two different pieces of footage. There's no reason you need to put it into Adobe Premiere, because the system we had at our jail, you could just export all of the footage directly from the program itself that saved all the footage. There's no need to edit it. There's no need to put it into Premiere or anything like that. You can export it, and you can export it in such a way that it doesn't give you like this gigantic, ridiculous, completely unfeasible file size. You can scale all of this from the program itself. There's no reason to put it in a third-party editor like Adobe, and doing that in and of itself basically makes that this footage will not stand up in a court of law when you do something like that. So there's no reason to do that. And not only this, they come out and Pam Bondi said the reason there's a minute missing is because they have to the cameras have to reset at midnight, and it's an old system. That just seems like such a bunch of horseshit to me. Not only are the systems that we have completely circumnavigate that, you have one of the premier jails in the country, you have one of the most high security jails in the country, and you're telling me you're using this system that erases a minute every single night? Come on, man, that's just ridiculous. That's insane. And I've never heard of any jail having to do something like this. It's totally crazy. So when they come out with this footage, and of course, apparently this isn't even the footage of his actual cell. This is a footage of someone else's cell that doesn't actually capture what we're looking for. So it's a total fucking joke. It's totally nonsense, totally a bunch of crap. And the last thing I'll mention on this here is that the cells in our special housing unit, they all had cameras in them. Each individual cell had a camera in it. And I was actually watching on Breaking Points, there was an interview with someone who was a former inmate at this jail. And he said that people would cover up the cameras in the cells. And he'd say, oh, that people would just let that slide. I don't know what kind of fucking amateur hour bullshit they're running, because when I worked at the jail, you would never let that slide. The second somebody covers up their camera for more than like a plausible, if they have to go to the bathroom, they'll cover up the camera and they'll uncover it after 15 minutes or something like that. So you can get away with covering it a little bit for a little bit of time. But if you try and cover up your camera all the time, particularly if you're in a high security area like the special housing unit, that would not at all fly at the jail I worked at. And it was not as supposedly secure as this one. But the second you would do something like that at the jail I worked at, they would call the TAC team on you and they would basically extract you from the cell. Absolutely, you could not get away with that. And the idea that maybe they did let Epstein cover up the camera and let all the other inmates cover up the camera, but the idea that they did that and got away with that is just totally insane to me and totally runs contradictory to what my experience was. Long story short, that's why I don't believe Epstein killed himself. I believe he was killed. And I believe that the best way to have done it would to have been with assistance from someone who was an employee at the Metropolitan Correctional Center, someone who basically either knew how the cameras worked, knew how the operations worked, and was able to basically let you in at the right time. And that would be the way to do it effectively, is you would have to have somebody working with you on the inside. And when you're talking at these kind of high levels of power, it's very possible you could get somebody to do that. Yeah, that's the reason why I don't believe Epstein killed himself, because it's harder than you think to hang yourself in a jail cell. And if you wanted to actually do that, there are other easier ways that he could have done that. And the idea that this footage that we have, and we don't have footage from inside the cell itself being released, is just completely insane to me. And it's totally insane that you would A, edit this footage in something like Adobe Premiere, and B, you have this system that erases a minute every fucking day. That would be unacceptable. That'd be completely unacceptable. Maybe one day we can talk about, and one thing I want to talk about, ICE and how awful their training is. Completely contradicted to the training that I got when I moved out of corrections and into a policing role. But that's for another story, for another time. At least I could shine a little bit of a light on my past and some of the things that I've done, some of the things that I've seen, and how they run completely contradictory to what I'm seeing in this case in front of my very eyes. We're going to wrap up this part. I want to move into, because I just had to take a little break in between recording. And of course, there's some new Epstein news. And who would have thought that you can never ever, this story is, they have it in the perfect right now way that if you're a media company, this is what you want, where they're dripping out little bits of information every so often. And if you have a media story like that, you can effectively keep it going forever, right? Just drip out new little informations, new little leaks, and give it a lot of legs. But anyway, even when I got out of the correction system and moved on to other parts of law enforcement, there's been stupid like correctional vernacular that I have not been able to shake. And it's funny because I've talked to people who have been in either in corrections or in policing or whatever have you in different parts of both Canada and the United States. And one of the things that I always hear all the time is like every little jurisdiction has its own kind of slang and its own kind of weird terms. So one that I can never get rid of here, and this is only apparently an Alberta thing, is the term goof. Goof is like the ultimate prison insult here. It's the effective same thing as calling someone a pedophile. So a lot of times when I say this guy's a goof, it's part of this old prison vernacular that I can't drop. And it's me insulting them, not sounding like I'm terribly insulting them. So that's one that if you have listened for a little bit, you might have heard me use more often than you would think. And now that I said it, you'll probably pick it up more and more. And another one, and this is definitely in reference to Epstein here, is the phrase Skinner. Skinner refers to someone who is a pedophile or a sex offender. And Jeffrey Epstein is the ultimate Skinner. And here's a story before we move on. I remember way, way back in the day, this must have been almost 10 years ago now, when I was dealing with this inmate. We were processing him, whatever you want to say. And he was charged with sexual assault against a minor. And he was pretending to be a Catholic priest. He wasn't actually a Catholic priest, but he like bought robes and stuff like that and would pretend to be one. So he was like the fake priest or whatever. And when we were bringing this guy up and down the corridors of the jail, my partner, he would play a compilation of Superintendent Chalmers going, Skinner, Skinner, Skinner. And I thought it was the funniest shit ever. This is our professionalism. And I'll tell you why sometimes professionalism in such an environment is hard, because I maintained a certain amount of respect and professionalism with this guy. And this guy said thank you to me. He's like, thank you for being respectful. Thank you for being a decent human being. And I felt like the biggest piece of garbage on the planet. I felt like I was the biggest scumbag for being respectful to this guy. So sometimes things get really warped and really fucked up in that world. So that's only a small taste of some of the stories I could bring to you guys in the future. But let's move on to the breaking news, which just came out as I was in between recording sessions. So this piece has been reported in multiple news outlets that the Trump administration has been told, specifically Pam Bondi told Trump, that back in May, his name did appear in the Epstein files. So, of course, the files, first they didn't exist. And then, of course, they were doctored. It came out and said that they were doctored by the Democrats. And now we're learning that, yes, actually, the least surprising news ever, he was on the list, that he was in the files and cited numerous times. And apparently, according to what we're beginning to learn, is that not only was he cited numerous times, but many people close to him were as well. And this is part of the reason why we can go over some of the kind of ridiculous claims people have brought up as to why we should bury this and why we shouldn't talk about it anymore, why we should move on. And one of the ones is that if the Democrats had all of this dirt on Trump, don't you think they would have released these files? And the answer is obviously no, because there are many high-ranking members of the Democratic Party, Bill Clinton most foremost among them. I'm sure there were plenty of people tied to Joe Biden that were on these files and listed extensively, and it would be a form of effectively mutually assured destruction. So there's no reason for them to release these files because, yeah, you'll take down Trump, but in the meantime, you'll be taking down yourself as well. And as we learned with Joe Biden's desperate cling to power last year, refusing to step aside and actually have a primary process where a suitable candidate could be found to run against Trump in 2024, we learned that he cares about himself a whole lot more than taking down somebody else. I have also been one of the foremost people on the fuck Bill Clinton train because I've hated that guy for years. And I am more than happy if the evidence comes out that he was involved in human trafficking, he should go to jail. Because not only is this obviously a heinous crime, but just because Bill Clinton was a Democrat and the Democratic Party is not something I have a lot of love for to begin with, but he is a Democrat that brought the party significantly to the right, ushered in this era of neoliberalism, ushered in this light form of Reagan economics that has basically set the party up for the disaster that it is today. Fuck that guy. I wouldn't give a shit if he rotted in jail for the rest of his life. But some of the other ridiculous statements that I've heard, things like the only reason you want the Epstein files to be opened is because you want to view the tapes. That's one that I've heard, which is no. Obviously, nobody wants to view the tapes. And of course, what we've heard about the amount of tapes that exist, they exist in the thousands. And you want me to believe that this guy had all of these tapes just for his own personal consumption? Not a hope in hell, right? There's no one that has that much pornography of any type for their own personal consumption and solely their own personal consumption. But that's what we call possession for the purposes of trafficking, right? At the very least, the reason you have all of those tapes is that you are distributing them in some way or another. And for this case, it wouldn't necessarily be for distribution. It would be for holding information and holding dirt over somebody's head. And of course, now they're trying to bring back the whole Russia gate. We had recently Trump coming out and saying that Obama's a traitor. He rigged the election, he stole the election. And one of the most ridiculous things about this is obviously not going to go anywhere. Look at what a great job, great in quotes, he did when it came to locking up Hillary Clinton. Remember how often he banged that drum, that we'd lock her up, put her in jail, still a free woman. So there's not only that track record, but if you guys remember, not that long ago, the Supreme Court came out and effectively validated presidential immunity by a wide margin. They effectively gave a blank check to, and this was beneficial for Trump at the time because it basically made it so that anything he did in office could be easily passed off as doing in the official capacity of the president, which effectively makes the president above the law. And Obama's a former president too. And all of this stuff is alleged to have happened while he was in office. So all of these protections are there for Obama just as much as they were for Trump. So anything that ends up happening, if on the far-fetched possibility that something does end up happening, effectively Obama will be covered by the same protections as Trump was. So it's really a big nothing burger. It's one of those nothing ever happens meme moments. So I'm not too worried about that. It's a very obvious deflection and distraction from the real issue. And the hits just keep on rolling for this guy. We had, of course, the release a couple days ago of this really bizarre letter by the Wall Street Journal that Trump gave to that Trump gave to Epstein on his birthday. And quite frankly, I believe that to be 100% believe that was real, that he absolutely gave Jeffrey that card. We're learning more and more about how close these guys really were. They were effectively neighbors for a long time. And not just that, it seems like they were pretty close friends in addition to that. And it's pretty clear that these guys were thick as thieves for quite a long time. And now just today, CNN is releasing photos of Epstein at one of Trump's weddings back in the early 90s. And again, like I'm saying, the hits just keep on rolling. There's no way anymore that this guy can deny how close he was to Epstein. At this point, he should be shifting more towards, oh, I didn't know what he was up to type of thing. Yeah, sure, we were friends, but obviously I had no idea what he was doing behind the scenes. I guess that would be pretty weak, but at the same time, there's just so much overwhelming evidence that these guys were close that you can't deny it anymore. And I've had this conversation on my Discord with some of the members where we're talking about if this will shake a lot of the MAGA base away from Trump. And well, there are definitely going to be the Trump cultists that will not leave. They're always going to be pipe-hitting members of the tribe, especially at this point. Like if you're still a pipe-hitting member of the tribe at this point, you are beyond hope. But I have seen a huge amount of bipartisan support for the release of the Epstein files. This has been the one thing that I've seen unite the left and the right most in quite a long time. So I think, yes, there are always going to be those guys that hold on to dear life, but there are a lot of people waking up to what is going on and waking up to the fact that Trump was never going to drain the swamp. He is a swamp creature. He is defending the rich and powerful. He is one of those pedophile elite that were discussed about in so many conspiracy theories. There was this idea that it was only the Democrats doing this, but unfortunately for them, powerful people on both sides of the aisle are implicated in heinous acts, and this doesn't just involve child sex trafficking, like we mentioned earlier. This involves a whole slew of potential different crimes that when you're powerful, when you're famous, when you have a lot of connections, you can get away with. And at that point, if you are not a morally congruent person, if you are not in power for the right reasons and actually have a moral compass that points north, if you will, you are going to find yourself being sucked in by these pleasures, sucked in by these temptations of power, and all of a sudden you're going to find yourself, you'll be like a fly in Epstein's web, effectively. You find yourself being sucked in and tempted by all these pleasures, and guess what? Those pleasures have a significant cost, and not to get too spiritual about it, you could say that cost is your soul, but in reality, that cost is any kind of credibility, any kind of real life, any kind of freedom that you might have left. And let's end on this note here. I am not a religious man, but I've found myself, especially as I age, becoming very fascinated with Eastern religious doctrine, and particularly Zen Buddhism. And in Buddhism, there's this idea that hell exists, right? There is a hell out there, but it's very different from the Christian conception of hell. The Buddhist version of hell is something that you create for yourself. And the way that you find yourself heading down the road to hell in Buddhist philosophy is by exclusively catering to your pleasures, exclusively catering towards your temptations. Because what happens over time is if all you ever do is chase those pleasures, chase those temptations, you find yourself having to raise the bar more and more. And eventually you'll have had all of the pleasures. You'll have all of the temptations. And that only leaves you with one last place to go. And that leaves you with only one more place to go. And that is pain. That is despair. That is hurting others in order to give yourself that last bit of pleasure that you can no longer attain. And once you start going down that road of causing pain, of inflicting pain for your own personal pleasure, that's when you're creating the cage for yourself. And sooner or later, you're going to lock yourself in it, and it's going to be game over. And that's what I think happens to a lot of these powerful people. It's not some sort of grand conspiracy. It's what happens when you get all the power, you get all the wealth, and you start chasing all these pleasures. If you're not grounded, if you're not a actually congruent person, what's going to happen is that you're going to eventually start causing pain to give yourself pleasure. And I think that's what's happened to so many of these powerful people over time. This is the story of Jeffrey Epstein in a nutshell, taking advantage of that fundamental weakness of human beings, particularly once they get to those upper echelons of wealth and power and connections, and are able to fulfill whatever desires they want at a whim. And with that's going to bring us to the end of our show. I know in many ways it was a downer, and I'm sorry about that, you guys, but when you're talking about one of the most high-profile criminals, one of the most high-profile sex traffickers in our modern times, it's difficult not to get a little bit down. It's difficult not to get a little bit depressed. But I do think that this is a serious issue for the Trump administration. This may be the beginning of the end for him. I am trying not to be too hopeful, getting out ahead of my skis here, but it really does seem like this is such a fundamental betrayal. And we didn't even really talk about his rants on Truth Social, where he called his former, quote unquote, former followers, he called them weaklings, he called them stupid, insulting them to their faces. And this is one of the things that I don't think that many people would appreciate, regardless of whatever political persuasion you happen to be in. One of the issues that people have brought forward about left-wing commentary and how people on the left treat politics is that they can be abrasive and they can be insulting towards people on the right. Now when you have your own messiah insulting you, your own leader calling you stupid, calling you weak, I don't think many people are going to respond too positively to that. In fact, I think that's going to be a very prominent catalyst in having people turn away from your movement and turning away from supporting you. And I do think that there is a critical point for us on the left that if people are starting to see the light, former Trump supporters are starting to see the light over this issue and see that he really is not at all what they thought he was going to be, that he's not the champion of the people that he pretended to be. We've been saying this for a very long time, but now it's more obvious and more evident than ever. I think we should be, at this point, welcoming people back, particularly when they want to make amends. There's room for a couple I told you so's. There's definitely room for some of that, but to close the door and to say, you know what, we don't want you guys because of this ever, I don't think that is the best way to go. Again, like I mentioned, this is the most bipartisan movement that I've seen in a very long time, and I think we should take advantage of that. So yeah, that's the show. That's really the end of the show. I know that as soon as I stop recording, there's going to be a million different things that pop into my head as, oh man, I wish I had brought that up. I wish I had brought this up. I wish I had talked about that. I want to, and unfortunately that's part of recording a show like this is that happens a lot. You forget to mention something, and then as soon as you turn off the camera, you're like, God damn it, I wanted to put that in, and I forgot to say that. But I'll be keeping an eye on that. I'm actually going out of province for a little bit, taking what may be the last vacation I get to take for quite some time, and going to spend some time reflecting and a little bit of time away from politics. I definitely wanted to get this episode out before I went out of province and talk about this, because if I didn't, who the hell knows when I'm going to get the chance to come back again and what things are going to look like in the future. I do hope that this story keeps burning. I do hope that this story keeps simmering, because it's important to talk about, and it's just such a powerful illustration of a lot of the hypocrisy of the MAGA movement, a lot of the hypocrisy of Donald Trump in particular, and it's going to be a huge rallying cry and something that people will point to for quite a number of years to come. So with that, I want to thank you guys for watching. This has been the Comrades signing off for now, and until next time, you guys take care.